Welcome back, UPSC aspirants, to another deep dive into the most important current affairs from March 12th, 2025. I'm excited to jump right in today.
Yeah, absolutely. This is part two, and we've got a lot to cover, so let's get started.
Okay, first up, let's talk about something that impacts us all. The effectiveness of our very own parliament. I was looking at some data on parliamentary productivity, and to be honest, I was a bit concerned by what I saw.
Yeah, it is a little worrying. Both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, both houses, have seen a significant drop in their productivity. And this isn't just about, politicians arguing or whatever. There are some deeper reasons we need to think about.
Okay, so deeper reasons. Well, let's start with some recent examples. Think back to the Hindenburg controversy. Huge issues like that, they naturally grab everyone's attention and lead to some, well, pretty heated debates.
Right, right. Exactly. Big issues, they're bound to spark debate and discussion. And those discussions, they can sometimes lead to disruptions in Parliament. It's just the nature of the beast.
Okay, so we've got these major issues causing disruptions. But I think it's fair to say that there's also a fair bit of political strategy at play, right?
Oh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. Disruptions can be a very powerful tool for the opposition. A way to maybe stall things, delay a vote, block something the ruling party wants to push through.
It's all about applying pressure, right? Making
Yeah.
headlines and trying to force the government's hand.
Exactly. It's all part of the political game. And then on top of these big issues and the political maneuvering, you also have to factor in some of the structural issues within the parliament itself.
So it's not just about the players. It's about the playing field itself.
Right. The sheer number of political parties we have in India, that can definitely complicate things. And then there's the lack of really strict time limits for debates and proceedings. It can all contribute to things getting a bit, shall we say, chaotic.
So it's a mix of, genuine heated debate on important issues plus political maneuvering, and then you add in a system that isn't always the most efficient. Okay, I get that. But why should our listeners care? Why is this a big deal, especially for someone studying for the UPSC exam?
Right, that's the key question. Well, think of it this way. When Parliament is constantly being disrupted, it means there's less time for actual meaningful debate, which is, well, that's a problem, right? Less debate means less scrutiny, less accountability for the government. And sometimes laws end up being passed in a hurry without proper discussion and consideration.
And that's where the problem lies, right? If laws aren't being properly debated, that erodes the trust people have in the system. It makes them feel like their elected representatives aren't really focused on serving the people, but more on just, playing politics and blocking each other.
Exactly. It creates a sense of disillusionment, and that's never good for a democracy. You need people to believe in the institutions, to feel like their voices are being heard.
Makes sense. It's a good reminder that a well-functioning parliament is at the very heart of a healthy democracy. Okay, well, let's shift gears a bit now. From the often messy world of politics to something a little more, well, cutting edge. I'm talking about epigenome editing.
No, this is some exciting stuff, something you'll definitely want to have on your radar for the UPSC exam.
It sounds pretty complex. Can you break it down for us? What exactly is epigenome editing, and how is it different from, say, traditional gene editing?
Sure. So traditional gene editing, that's all about directly altering the DNA sequence, like rewriting the genetic code. Epigenome editing is a bit different. It's more like, think of it like a volume knob for gene expression.
A volume knob. So instead of changing the song itself, you're adjusting how loud or quiet it plays.
Exactly. You're not rewriting the genetic code. You're fine-tuning how those genes are actually expressed, how active they are.
And what kind of possibilities does this open up? Why is everyone so excited about epigenome editing?
Well, imagine being able to treat really complex diseases, things like cancer, neurological disorders, even some mental health conditions, by actually targeting the root cause at the genetic level. And not just treating, but potentially even preventing these diseases.
That sounds amazing. But are we talking about, designer babies and all that?
No, not at all. Epigenome editing is much more targeted and precise than that. You see, the changes made through epigenome editing, they're not permanent, they're reversible. So it significantly reduces the risk of unintended and lasting modifications to the genome. It's like having a reset button for gene expression.
Ah, so a reset button. So like you're tweaking the settings, but you can always go back to the default if needed. That sounds a lot safer than, permanently altering someone's genes.
Exactly. And that's why there's so much excitement around this technology. It's a much more controlled and less risky approach to gene therapy with the potential to revolutionize how we treat and even prevent diseases.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on. I have a feeling this is going to be popping up in those UPSC science and technology questions. Well, speaking of the UPSC, let's dive into a topic directly related to the Sustainable Development Goals. Have you heard of this new indicator, the Minimum Dietary Diversity, or MDD?
Oh, yes, MDD. It's a pretty important one, especially if you're looking to ace those SDG-related questions on the exam. It's all about emphasizing the importance of a varied diet, making sure people, especially those who are more vulnerable, like women and children, are getting the nutrients they need.
So it's not just about filling your stomach, it's about what you're filling it with, making sure you're getting a good mix of all the essential nutrients.
Precisely. And this new MDD indicator, it gives us a much clearer picture of, the nutritional needs of a population and helps us track progress towards achieving that second SDG, zero hunger.
Okay, so it's a tool to measure progress and hopefully to design more effective strategies to combat malnutrition, especially in areas where it's most prevalent. Makes sense. But what's the situation in India specifically? I mean, how are we doing on the MDD front?
Well, the data paints a bit of a concerning picture, to be honest. There are some pretty significant disparities across different regions in India. The central region, in particular, states like Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, they're facing the biggest challenge. A huge percentage of children in these states, like way too many, experience what's called minimum dietary diversity failure.
That's pretty alarming. And it highlights how important it is to have these kinds of indicators, right? It's not just about abstract numbers. It's about understanding the real-life implications, the lived reality of people, and using that data to guide us towards better solutions.
You got it. Data like this can be a powerful tool for policymakers to identify the most vulnerable populations and design interventions that are truly effective. It's about ensuring everyone has access to the nutrition they need to thrive, and that's a fundamental aspect of sustainable development. Okay, so moving on. Let's talk about something that's becoming more and more important in today's world. The whole issue of drones and the need for, well, what's called a robust counter-unmanned aerial system strategy. It's a bit of a mouthful, but we usually just call it CUAS.
Drones, huh? Yeah. I mean, they're fun for taking cool videos and stuff, but I can see how they could be a real threat in the wrong hands.
Right. You're right to be concerned. This is a rapidly evolving security challenge, and it has pretty much every major military, including India's, on high alert. And a CUAS strategy, it's not just about shooting down drones. It's about a much broader approach, detecting them, tracking them, and neutralizing them before they can actually cause any harm.
So it's like a multi-layered defense system specifically for drones.
Mhm.
Okay, I get it. But why is this something that a UPSC aspirant should be paying attention to?
Well, for a few reasons. I mean, first of all, the nature of warfare is changing, right? And understanding these new threats, like the threat posed by drones and how India is preparing to deal with them, that's crucial for the exam. Drones are becoming incredibly sophisticated and, unfortunately, more accessible, which means they could be used for all sorts of malicious activities.
Okay, so more sophisticated and easier to get. What kind of threats are we talking about specifically? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Think about those swarm attacks, like the one we saw just last year, the 2025 attack on Russia's Black Sea port of Tuabs. They used a whole bunch of small drones to target personnel and equipment, and it caused a lot of disruption.
Right, so that's like a tactical threat, using drones to directly attack people or equipment. What about something on a larger scale?
Well, there are also strategic threats. Remember the 2025 Houthi drone attacks on those Saudi oil facilities? Those attacks were targeting critical infrastructure, and the damage and chaos they caused were massive. And as drones become more readily available, well, it means that non-state actors, terrorist groups even, could potentially get their hands on them.
Okay, now that is a scary thought. So what is India doing to counter these drone threats? I mean, are we just sitting ducks here?
No, not at all. India is taking this threat very seriously. In fact, the DRDO, they've developed something called the D4S system, which stands for Drone Detect, Deter, and Destroy. Pretty cool name, right?
Drone detect, deter, and destroy. Yeah, it does have a nice ring to it. So what can the system do?
Well, it can detect and jam micro drones from, like, kilometers away, and it can even neutralize them using lasers.
Wait, lasers?
Yeah.
We talking like Star Wars stuff here?
Yeah, kind of. It's pretty high-tech stuff. And Parrot Electronics, they've developed the Drone Guard system, which is another sophisticated system for, detecting, tracking, and taking down rogue drones. And then there's the Lacaze HYA, which is a reusable target drone that they use for testing and training purposes.
So it's like a whole ecosystem of drone defense, technology, strategy, and training all working together.
Exactly. It's a reminder that the nature of warfare is changing, and staying ahead of the curve is essential. It's not just about military strategists, but for all of us, really, especially for those of you who are aspiring to be part of the civil services. You need to understand these evolving threats and how India is responding to them.
Makes sense. The whole new battlefield out there. Okay, let's bring things back down to earth a bit now, literally. Let's talk about preventive detention.
This is a big one, and it's been in the news a lot lately. It's a complex issue with a lot of legal and ethical dimensions.
So for those who might not be totally familiar with the concept, can you give us a quick rundown of what preventive detention actually means?
Sure, so preventive detention is basically detaining someone, holding them without a trial based on the idea that they might pose a threat in the future. So it's not about punishing someone for something they've already done. It's about preventing something from happening.
So it's preemptive, trying to neutralize a threat before it materializes. But I imagine that raises a lot of concerns about, potential abuse of power, about individual rights being violated.
You're absolutely right. That's why we have constitutional safeguards in place to try and prevent that kind of abuse. Article 22 of the Indian Constitution, it outlines specific conditions and limitations for preventive detention. For example, you can't hold someone for more than 3 months without an advisory board reviewing the case.
Right, so there are checks and balances in place, but it's still a very sensitive issue and one that requires a lot of careful consideration.
Absolutely. There was actually a really interesting Supreme Court ruling recently that really highlighted this.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
So, the Supreme Court overturned a preventive detention order that had been issued by the Nagaland government. And the court made it very clear that authorities need to do their own independent assessment of whether detention is really necessary. They can't just rely on, subjective judgments or vague suspicions.
So, a good reminder that the judiciary plays a crucial role in safeguarding fundamental rights, even in matters of national security. Okay, moving on, let's talk about something that comes up a lot on the UPSC exam, the Indian Railways.
The Indian Railways, yes, a vast and complex network and a vital part of our country's infrastructure. There was a report recently by the Standing Committee on Railways that highlighted some of the challenges they're facing.
I'm all ears. What kind of challenges?
Well, one of the biggest ones is low net revenue. The railways are providing heavy subsidies on passenger fares.
So they're losing money on passenger transport.
Right, and the passenger revenue, which is currently around, 80,000 crore, it's dwarfed by the freight revenue, which is more like 1,080,000 crore.
So they make more from moving goods than people. Okay, but if they're losing money on passengers, that doesn't seem sustainable, does it?
It's definitely a concern. And on top of that, they also have the issue of insufficient capital expenditure. The railways rely heavily on budgetary support from the government, and there's not a lot of contribution from what are called extra budgetary resources. For this fiscal year, 2024-25, that contribution is only 10,000 crore.
So not a lot of money coming in from outside sources. That means they're pretty dependent on the government for funding.
Yeah, and that can be a problem, especially when you consider all the other demands on the government's budget.
So finding ways to generate more revenue and become more financially independent, that's got to be a top priority for the railways, right?
Absolutely. And then there are operational challenges. The average speed of freight trains in India is only about 25 kilometers per hour.
That's pretty slow, isn't it? Compared to other countries.
It is, and it means that goods take longer to reach their destinations, which has a knock-on effect on businesses, on supply chains, on the whole economy, really.
Right. It's all connected. So slow freight speeds, not enough revenue, too much reliance on government funding. What else?
Well, there are also delays in land acquisition, which means that projects like new railway lines, they're not getting completed on time. And then there's the modernization of railway stations, which is moving at a snail's pace, leaving a lot of stations without basic amenities. It all adds up to a perception of inefficiency.
So a whole bunch of financial, operational, and infrastructural challenges. What's the solution? What does the report recommend?
Well, for starters, they suggest implementing dynamic pricing models for passenger fares, like what airlines do, adjusting prices based on demand. That could help generate some much-needed revenue. They also talk about exploring non-fair revenue streams, things like advertising and leasing out station spaces.
Okay, so diversifying their income streams. Makes sense.
Right. And to reduce their dependence on the government, they're recommending setting higher targets for public-private partnerships, or PPPs. That way, they can bring in private investment and expertise.
PPPs, yeah, that's a model we've seen work well in other sectors.
Exactly. And they've also emphasized the need to speed up the implementation of the KAVAK system.
Kavak, refresh my memory. What is that again?
It's that indigenously developed automatic train protection system. It's all about enhancing safety and efficiency, especially on those high-density routes. They're also pushing for things like upgrading the signaling systems and streamlining those land acquisition processes.
Okay, so a mix of short-term fixes to generate revenue and long-term investments in infrastructure and technology.
Exactly. It's a complex system, but with the right strategies and commitment, the Indian Railways can definitely overcome these challenges and continue to play a vital role in India's growth and development.
It's a good reminder that even in a sector as large and complex as the railways, focused interventions and well-thought-out reforms can actually make a real difference. Okay, let's zoom out a bit now and look at the global stage. What's happening with international arms transfers? Any interesting trends there?
There are some pretty significant shifts happening, actually. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, they recently released a report on global arms transfers covering the period from 2020 to 2024.
Okay, so what did they find? Anything surprising?
Well, one of the most striking findings is the massive surge in Ukraine's arms imports. I mean, due to the ongoing conflict, their arms imports have increased by a factor of almost 100. They're now the world's largest arms importer.
Wow, 100 times. That's incredible. It really shows you how geopolitical events can shake things up. So who's supplying all these weapons?
Well, the United States, they've further solidified their position as the world's top arms exporter. They now control about 43% of the global market. On the flip side, Russia's arms exports, they've taken a big hit, dropping by 64%.
Wow, big drop for Russia. So they've gone from first to, what, third place now?
Yeah, they're behind France now. It's likely due to a combination of things, the impact of those international sanctions. Plus, they need to prioritize supplying their own military, especially with the ongoing conflict. It's interesting how quickly things can change in the global arms market.
It is. So where does India fit into all of this?
Well, India is currently the second largest arms importer in the world after Ukraine. But the good news is that our arms imports have actually decreased by about 9% compared to the previous 5-year period.
So we're importing fewer arms. That's a positive sign, isn't it?
It is. And it's partly due to the growth of domestic arms production within India. We're becoming more self-reliant, which is one of the government's key goals.
Right? Reducing dependence on foreign suppliers, boosting our own defense industry. It's a win-win, both for our national security and for our economy.
Exactly. And while Russia is still a major supplier, we're seeing a diversification strategy happening. India's been procuring arms from other countries as well, places like France, the United States, and Israel.
So not putting all our eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Precisely. It's about maintaining flexibility and strategic autonomy.
Makes sense.
Hmm.
Okay, let's shift focus now to a place that, honestly, I'm not too familiar with. It's been in the news recently. It's a small island nation called Vanuatu.
Ah, Vanuatu. Yeah, it's a fascinating place. They made headlines recently because of an incident involving an Indian fugitive who was wanted by Interpol. The Prime Minister of Vanuatu actually canceled the passport that had been issued to this guy.
Wow, a bold move. But tell me, where exactly is Vanuatu, and why is this case getting so much attention?
So Vanuatu is way out in the South Pacific, east of Australia, west of Fiji. It's part of what's called Melanesia, and it's made up of over 80 islands. They got their independence back in 1980 after being jointly administered by Britain and France. The islands themselves are volcanic, so you've got these amazing mountains, lush forests, and beautiful coastal plains.
Sounds beautiful. I'm adding it to my travel list. But getting back to the case, why is it so significant?
Well, I think it highlights the challenges of international law enforcement. Even small island nations like Vanuatu are part of this global network, and they have to deal with these complex issues of extradition and international cooperation. It's a reminder that we're all connected, no matter how far apart we might seem geographically.
True. It's a small world after all. Okay, well, let's jump back to the Indian economy now. I saw something about an anti-dumping duty. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So anti-dumping duty, or ADD, it's basically a tool that governments use to protect domestic industries from unfair competition from imports.
Unfair competition. What does that mean?
Well, dumping is when a company exports a product at a price that's way lower than what it sells for in its own domestic market. And it can really hurt local industries, undercutting their prices and potentially driving them out of business.
Ah, so it's like predatory pricing, trying to gain market share by selling at a loss.
Exactly. And that's where ADD comes in. It's a way for the government to level the playing field and protect domestic producers.
So in this case, what product are we talking about?
This particular case involves certain water treatment chemicals that are being imported from China and Japan.
And who decides whether to impose an ADD?
Well, the Directorate General of Trade Remedies, or DGTR, they're the ones who investigate these cases and recommend whether a duty should be imposed. And then the final decision is made by the Ministry of Finance.
Okay, so it's a pretty rigorous process. It's interesting to see how these economic levers are used to regulate trade and protect domestic interests. Now, let's talk about something a bit more concrete, something that's actually being built right now. I'm talking about the Visakhapatnam port in Kerala.
Yes, the Visakhapatnam port. This is a major project, and it's going to be India's first deep-water container transshipment port. They just got approval for the second and third phases of development, so things are moving along nicely.
I've heard of transshipment ports, but I don't really understand what makes them so special. Can you explain?
Sure. So a transshipment port, it's basically a hub where cargo, usually in containers, is transferred from one ship to another. It's like a relay point for goods that are being transported along different shipping routes. In Visakhapatnam's location, it's a major advantage. It's just 10 nautical miles from that main international shipping route that connects Europe, the Persian Gulf, and the Far East.
So it's strategically located right in the heart of a major trade route. What else is special about this port?
Well, the way it's being developed is also interesting. It's a DBFOT model, which stands for Design, Build, Finance, Operate, and Transfer. It's a public-private partnership where the government provides the land and basic infrastructure, and then a private partner takes on the responsibility for everything else, building it, running it, and maintaining it.
So it's a way to leverage the expertise and resources of both the public and private sectors.
Exactly. And this kind of model has been very successful in other infrastructure projects.
It's a good example of how India is using innovative approaches to develop its infrastructure and boost its economy. Now let's switch gears again and talk about something a little closer to nature. What's the story with cassava?
Cassava, also known as yucca or manioc, it's a root vegetable that's a staple food for millions of people, especially in tropical regions. And a recent study found that in some areas, the survival of these cassava crops is really dependent on indigenous farming knowledge.
So the wisdom of traditional practices is still relevant, even in the 21st century. That's pretty amazing.
It is, and it highlights the importance of preserving and respecting those traditional knowledge systems. It's not just about cultural heritage, but also about the practical value of that knowledge.
Right. Sometimes the solutions to modern problems can be found by looking to the past. So cassava is an important food source, and it's also being used for ethanol production here in India. It's amazing how versatile it is.
It is, and the fact that it's so closely tied to indigenous knowledge makes it even more fascinating.
Okay, well, let's move on to a health issue now, one that's been a persistent challenge globally. I'm talking about tuberculosis, or TB, as is more commonly known.
TB is a serious issue, and it's something that we can't afford to ignore. But there have been some encouraging developments. The Ministry of Health reported that over 6 lakh TB patients have been identified and notified under that intensified TB elimination campaign that they launched back in 2024.
That's good news. But what about drug-resistant TB? That's still a big problem, isn't it?
It is. When the bacteria that cause TB mutate, they can become resistant to the drugs that we use to treat it. And it makes treatment much more difficult. There are different levels of resistance. MDR-TB, which is multi-drug resistant TB, that's resistant to the 2 most effective first-line drugs. And then there's XDR-TB, extensively drug-resistant TB, which is resistant to even more drugs.
So it's a moving target. We're constantly having to come up with new ways to fight this disease.
Exactly. And India has the highest TB burden in the world, accounting for over a quarter of all cases globally. So it's a challenge that we have to address head-on.
Okay, well, let's shift gears one last time. There was a news story recently about an incident in the North Sea. What happened there?
The North Sea, it's a vital waterway. Lots of international shipping and energy transport happens there. And there was an incident recently where a fuel tanker was carrying fuel for the U.S. military. It collided with a cargo ship. There was a fire, and it really highlighted the risks and vulnerabilities in that area.
The North Sea is also a major source of oil and gas.
Right.
Brent crude, that's the benchmark for oil prices globally. It comes from there. So any disruptions in that region could have a big impact on the global economy.
Exactly. And this incident, it just underscores the importance of maritime safety, especially in these strategically crucial waterways.
It's a good reminder that geopolitics isn't just about what happens on land. The seas are just as important. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about the recent military exercise between India and Japan.
Right, the sixth edition of Exercise Dharma Guardian. It just wrapped up at the East Fuji training area in Japan. It's a sign of the growing strategic partnership between the two countries.
And what are the focus of this particular exercise?
Well, it was mainly focused on counterterrorism operations, especially in urban environments. And they also did some training for UN peacekeeping operations, things like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief.
So a pretty broad range of activities, all focused on building interoperability and cooperation between the Indian and Japanese militaries.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that security challenges are becoming more and more complex, and cooperation between like-minded countries is essential.
Wow, we've really covered some ground today, huh? From parliament and politics to drones and defense, from cutting-edge science to traditional farming practices.
It's true. We've touched on a lot of different issues, but they're all interconnected in a way, right? They all paint a picture of the complex world we live in. And that's what makes preparing for the UPSC exam so challenging and so rewarding, I think.
I agree. It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture, and understanding the forces that are shaping India's place in the world.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive series so valuable for UPSC aspirants. It's not just about giving you information. It's about helping you develop those critical thinking skills, that ability to analyze and synthesize information and form your own informed opinions. Exactly. We want to empower you to think for yourselves, to engage with these issues on a deeper level. And speaking of deeper levels, I have to say that story about cassava and the importance of indigenous knowledge really stuck with me.
Yeah, me too. It's a reminder that progress doesn't always mean abandoning traditional practices. Sometimes the answers we're looking for can be found in the wisdom of our ancestors.
It's about recognizing that there are multiple ways of knowing, multiple ways of understanding the world. And those different perspectives, those different knowledge systems, they can all contribute to finding solutions to the challenges we face.
So for our listeners out there who are on this UPSC journey, remember to keep an open mind, to be curious, to question assumptions. Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo and think outside the box.
That's how real change happens, by questioning, by exploring, by being willing to see things from different angles. And those are the qualities that will make you not just successful in the exam, but also effective and impactful civil servants.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into current affairs, I want to leave you with this thought. Don't just passively absorb information. Engage with it, wrestle with it, make it your own, because ultimately your success in the UPSC exam and in life depends on your ability to think critically, to analyze, to synthesize, and to articulate your own unique perspective.
And don't forget, we're here to support you every step of the way. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more deep dives, more insights, and more guidance as you navigate the exciting and challenging world of the UPSC exam.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for excellence. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the ever-evolving landscape of current affairs. Best of luck to all of you on your UPSC journey.